Dollops for pensioners, home buyers and school kids. Gifts at the dispatch box to get votes at the ballot box. Good evening. Despite the looming election, this is no giveaway budget. What gifts there are appear to be playing catch-up with the Tories, particularly on pensioners. But do the sums and the budget comes out neutral? The central issue tonight is growth. Gordon Brown is, as before, banking on a robust 2.5% to 3% for next year. He's been right for 9 years. Will he prove so for a 10th? Hitting the jack tonight for the elderly, a one-off £200 off the council tax and free bus travel for all pensioners. We report from the Bowling Greens of Middle England. Senators Clinton, McCain and Kennedy lambast the IRA in support of the McCartney Sisters.
But I think there's a time when it's to hold them and a time to fold them, and we're overdue in terms of the disbandment of the IRA.
And a hawk amongst the doves. Astonishment both sides of the Atlantic as Bush sends Rumsfeld's deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, to head up the World Bank.
And the other headlines tonight. Iraq's National Assembly meets for the first time, but it's still a parliament with no permanent president and no prime minister. The inquest into the death of skydiver Stephen Hilder hears he may have committed suicide. And the X chromosome revealed. Geneticists discover why men are merely degenerate women.
As he delivered his relatively short budget this afternoon, the shortest indeed since Gladstone, it became all too clear what was in the crosshairs of Mr Brown's sights, the Tories. The Chancellor let fly with a series of sweeteners on council tax, pensioners and families, aimed at trumping similar moves from the Conservatives. Not that he spent very much money to do so. Much of what he's giving away is a one-off, and much of it is paid for by increased revenues, including over £1 billion in a one-off take from North Sea oil companies. For Michael Howard, it was all a case of vote now, pay later. Here's the main points. To appeal to the grey vote, every pensioner household will receive a £200 council tax refund. And there'll be free off-peak local bus travel for over 60s and disabled people right across the country. On housing, the stamp duty threshold is doubled to £120,000, particularly helpful for first-time buyers. For taxpayers, the personal allowance goes up to £4,895, in line with inflation. There is a penny on beer, 4p on a bottle of wine, and 7p on 20 cigarettes. All the usual increases in duty, in line with inflation. The duty on petrol goes up by 1.2p per litre, with the increases deferred to September the 1st. That date, of course, conveniently after the likely general election, May the 5th. Our political editor, Eleanor Goodman, now reports on what's being seen as Gordon Brown's blueprint for an unprecedented third Labour term.
This was a Chancellor determined to come up with a vote-winning budget for the short term without creating problems for the economy in the longer term when he hopes to be Prime Minister. He did it by the ingenious device of squeezing not rich voters, but the cash flow of oil companies. The result was that he actually spent marginally less money than he raised. But what he did spend, he focused in a highly political way, providing help for key groups of voters and trying to restrict the Conservatives' room for manoeuvre. He began characteristically by using a football metaphor to try to get his achievements over to voters for whom quarterly GDP growth is purely academic.
Last year, one of our famous Premier football teams registered a record consecutive 49 matches unbeaten, but failed to record a 50th. In December, I reported 49 quarters of continued growth. Today, I can report economic growth for the 50th consecutive quarter.
The Conservatives say they'd fund tax cuts by cutting waste, so the Chancellor announced a cull of his own of quangos before turning his attention to first-time buyers, priced out of the market by soaring property prices. The Scottish Nationalists have offered them cash discounts. The Chancellor went for raising the stamp duty threshold by more than predicted.
I will raise the residential stamp duty starting threshold, doubling it to £120,000.
Families on low to middle earnings are targeted by all the parties and are widely expected to be offered a tax cut by the Conservatives. The Chancellor rejected raising tax thresholds on the grounds it would help the better off too. Instead, he's to make more money available to the low-paid through his own pet project of working families' tax credits.
So the best way to do most to help low and middle income families is not through a further rise in personal tax allowances, but through tax credits, which offer the best family tax cut. Universal education from
the Conservatives say that, in effect, means putting more people on benefit. The Chancellor rattled through how he was financing all this before turning his attention to education, promising a major investment in primary schools and further education colleges. Not a new increase in overall government spending, but money which he is now earmarking for education. Thus, he hopes boxing the Conservatives in.
We have made our choice: affordable tax cuts and essential spending improvements. Investments that would not be possible if we were to accept representations for 35 billion of spending cuts.
He reserves greatest generosity for pensioners, the group most likely to vote. The Conservatives have promised them a 50% discount on their council tax bills. The Chancellor is giving those who don't already have them free bus passes and a much bigger than expected discount on their council tax bills in this, the election year.
In the pre-budget report, I announced a £50 council tax refund. But today, with the resources now available, I can announce that we will pay to every pensionable household 65 and over paying council tax a refund not of £50, but a council tax refund of £200.
Ministers clearly thought they'd shot the Conservative fox, though afterwards the Tories claimed the council tax discount would more than offset next year by a reduction in the winter fuel tax allowance, a claim immediately discounted by the Chancellor.
Mr. Michael Howard.
The Conservative leader's immediate reaction, though, was more broad brush.
This is a vote now, pay later budget. Yeah. The simple fact is that if Labour get in again, taxes go up again. Yeah. This budget is not about what's good for our country, it's all about the interests of the Labour Party. Yeah. But I can agree with the Prime Minister on one thing. This budget is the last budget this Chancellor will ever deliver.
Mr Brown showed no sign of wanting to move anywhere other than into Mr Blair's job. The Liberal Democrat leader said taxes would increase under both main parties.
Neither of them are addressing the ticking bomb that is coming down the track, which is council tax revaluation. And if the recent experience in Wales is anything to go by, then you are going to have 7 million households in England alone finding themselves burdened with significantly more in terms of the impact of the council tax.
At the end of his speech, Labour MPs had roared their approval of the Chancellor. He'll now take a central role in the election campaign. If it takes off now, he'll get much of the credit.
This is a tiny budget in terms of overall spending in the economy. Some of the money is actually being spent on diffusing problems which are arguably of Gordon Brown's own making, like council tax bills. But what it's really about is establishing the dividing lines with the Conservatives. Targeted tax cuts and bigger increases in spending under Labour against bigger tax cuts but smaller increases in spending under the Conservatives. Elena Goodman, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, Gordon Brown called today's budget the prudent course for Britain, and on the face of it, it is anything but a pre-election giveaway, despite the eye-catching measures for pensioners and first-time buyers. But as ever, the devil is in the detail. Is the Chancellor going to borrow more money? Is his council tax rebate as generous as the Tory proposal it's designed to trump? To answer those questions and others, our economics correspondent Liam Halligan is here. Liam, what's the overall position?
Well, the overall position, John, is that given that there is an election around the corner, this is a remarkably prudent budget from Gordon Brown. Today's measures actually take money out of the economy. We've seen a small fiscal tightening of £265 million today, but a tightening nonetheless. Let's just have a look at some of the borrowing figures behind that headline of prudence. The Chancellor today laid out his new numbers for the next 4 years, and here they are. A £34 billion deficit this year, going forward to 27 billion in 2007-8. Compare that, John, with the borrowing projections over the same 4 years that the Chancellor outlined in last year's budget, and they're slightly lower. But compare them again with the borrowing projections over the same 4 years in 2003, much lower. In fact, the difference between the two sets of borrowing figures, £31 billion in extra borrowing. So behind the headline of prudence, there is quite a lot of extra borrowing going on.
Well, so a tax is going to rise after the election. And indeed, what about these council tax rebates?
Well, given today's prudent performance, Gordon Brown will be able to argue during the election campaign that taxes may not rise, but the fact is that every independent economist doesn't agree with him and thinks that they will. On the council tax issue, we've now got a proper political policy standoff, and I've laid it out here on council tax. Labour, we learnt today, will give pensioner households a £200 rebate on their council tax. But this is only a one-year policy, which will increase suggestions that it's a political bribe. The Tories, on the other hand, in some senses, they're being more generous. They'll halve pensioners' council tax with savings capped at £500. And the Tory policy is ongoing, John. It's not just for a single year. So the Tory policy works better if you're a pensioner living in a valuable house, because you could save up to £500 after all. The Labour policy works better if you're a pensioner with less money in a less valuable house, because you'll save £200 whatever happens. So again, Gordon Brown, he's spending less money than the Tories, but as Eleanor said, he's getting more bang for his political buck.
What about stamp duty?
Indeed, the real eye-catcher today, but again, it's not quite as it seems. We've seen a raise in the 1% tax duty today from £60,000 to £120,000. That will certainly help you if you live in the northwest and you're a first-time buyer, because 25% of houses are less than £120,000. In London, less than 2% of houses are, so there won't be an impact. We've seen in the fine print of this budget, actually, that the Chancellor has reduced and even abolished relief on stamp duty in economically disadvantaged areas. So on balance, he's actually making money on stamp duty as a result of today's measures. What's more, John, given this stamp duty reduction in the crucial £60,000 to £120,000 zone, house prices in that zone could actually increase, compounding the problems of first-time buyers. That's certainly the view of Professor David Miles, who's the man the Treasury specifically asked last year to look into this issue.
It's hard to see it having a substantial impact on houses that are above the £120,000 limit already. What you might expect is that houses that otherwise would have paid stamp duty would have been paid if they had been sold, would now be worth a bit more. So you might expect that house prices in the region of 60 to 120,000 will be somewhat higher than they otherwise would have been.
John, the Chancellor has been very clever, and he's basically made all this add up with an accounting trick. Buried in this budget is a line, modernisation of North Sea Oil Corporation tax, which nets the Chancellor more than £1 billion next year. What's basically happened is that he's asked North Sea oil companies to bring forward the payments of some of their taxes. They'll make no extra tax payments overall, but they will be helping the Chancellor out next year. As every economist and every Chancellor knows, John, the devil's in the detail.
Liam Hannigan. Well, now the politicians fight it out live in the studio later in the programme, and tomorrow at noon we're going to have a panel of experts to address your questions about the budget. By then you'll have had a chance to pore over some of the detail, and we'll no doubt be trying to work out whether you are better or worse off. Our wise men and women will answer as many of your questions as they can, so email us with your views at the usual address, channel4.com/news. Now, an albatross around the neck of Sinn Féin. Democrat grandee Senator Ted Kennedy on the IRA after his talks with the sisters and fiancé of Robert McCartney in Washington. A telling sign of changed times as the family of the murdered Belfast man prepare to meet President Bush tomorrow. Indeed, the President's special envoy to Northern Ireland has told Channel 4 News it's time for the IRA to put up shop, go home to their families and go out of business. He said that it was time for Sinn Féin to split from the IRA. Our Washington correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports.
It's a meeting of enormous symbolism. Ted Kennedy, grand old man of Irish Catholic America, turning his back on Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams and greeting the McCartney family instead. Washington's biggest political hitters, delivering an uncompromising message to Mr. Adams and the IRA.
I personally believe that Gerry Adams wants to see the IRA disbanded. But I think there's a time when it's hold them and a time to fold them, and we're overdue in terms of the disbandment of the IRA.
Washington now using the McCartney family's anger and grief to drive forward a peace process which has stalled.
We want to honor the Good Friday Accords and bring the murderers of Robert to justice.
And we say to anyone who has any ideas that the McCartney family are not doing the right thing and would discourage them from doing so, don't.
We timed it perfectly.
And at the State Department, the President's special envoy to Northern Ireland with an identical message, full backing for this family's rebellion against the rule of the gun.
I think the key issue, if you want to reduce it to a single issue, has to be the IRA. And 7 years after the Good Friday Agreement, 4 years after 9/11, it's time for the IRA to close shop and to go home to their families and let the Republican movement go forward on a purely peaceful means.
And I'm looking forward to meeting these very brave souls. They've committed themselves to a peaceful solution, and hopefully their loved one will not have died in vain. I mean, out of this, hopefully some good will come out of the evil perpetuated on this family.
It's a story worthy of a film script. A family from a tiny nationalist enclave of Protestant East Belfast about to meet America's president, and now the toast of the most powerful town on earth. These sisters hailed as extraordinary here, their campaign for justice turning into so much more.
We feel that if these people are not held to account, what the message is going to be is that peace is only something that's on a piece of paper. It's not real on the ground. People in Ireland want peace on the ground, and they want to know that they feel safe and free in their own communities. And an act of completion, to me, on Robert's murder is going to be the only way that people will feel that they can have that.
And less than a mile away, Gerry Adams, bad fairy at the McCartney Sisters ball, smarting from Ted Kennedy's description of the IRA as like an albatross round Sinn Féin's neck.
Of course we need a future which has all of the armed groups in retirement. Of course that's required.
He says the time. The President's envoy meeting us before the Sinn Féin leader this afternoon, adamant that the party has not fully cooperated in the McCartney murder inquiry, suggesting that if Mr. Adams wants a White House invitation next year, he should disband the IRA.
The IRA needs to go out of business.
But if Mr. Adams says that he wants to sever links with the IRA and that the IRA must disarm, that will presumably hurt his power base in parts of Northern Ireland.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think, in fact, if you look at the last few years, whenever they have moved towards a peaceful resolution of this conflict, acts of decommissioning, their popularity has increased.
But Mr. Rees is angry with the British too, claiming that Secretary of State Paul Murphy, also queuing to meet the sisters in Washington today, has the power to end Sinn Féin's freedom to raise money overseas. So we asked Mr. Murphy if he would turn off the tap.
Yes, we are looking at these issues because the rules are slightly different at the moment, and we have to examine them very carefully, but we do understand what people feel on it.
Less than 2 months after their brother was stabbed, this remarkable family has succeeded in placing every issue confronting Ulster back on the front page. There have been false dawns before, but America, a land of new beginnings, hoping this visit will give birth to a breakthrough. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Washington.
Doubters thought this day would never come, but it has. A democratically elected parliament met in Iraq today for the first time. Sarah Smith is monitoring that story and others for us. Sarah.
Thanks, John. It is a historic day in Iraq, but the country's elected representatives are still unable to form a government. The key stalling point is the strategic oil city of Kirkuk in the country's north. The Kurds want to expand their autonomous region to include the city, and they're also seeking assurances Iraq will remain secular. It's a parliament that has no president and no prime minister. 6 weeks after elections, Ayad Alawi's still the interim PM. They can't agree on a permanent one. So although the Iraqi National Assembly met today, it's not a national government, not yet. The delicate ethnic balance crucial to the makeup of any new government. A Shiite prime minister balanced by a Kurdish president and a Sunni speaker.
These discussions have been going on for some time now.
and we have reached broad agreements on the main principles in the constitution making and the government forming.
The Assembly has to meet in the secure green zone, and even as they did, militants fired mortars at government buildings, as they do most days. Inside, they began with a reading from the Quran. Kurds are concerned Iraq remains a secular state, and they want to include oil-rich Kirkuk in their autonomous zone, while Shiites want to absorb the Kurdish militia into Iraqi security forces. These are the arguments. The Shiite Islamist alliance did win over half the seats, but they still need the Kurds to achieve a necessary 2/3 majority.
Iraq is not easy. It is chaotic. The situation is messy. That's why I urge the interim government to be a government of partnership, and every segment of society has to have a say in the future of Iraq.
Voters want urgent government action to improve security and to restore basic services. They risked their lives to vote but see no results. Iraqi citizens feel depressed, says this man. We thought the depression would go away after the elections, but now hope is vanishing if the arguments between the parties carry on. And as the Assembly met, 3 Iraqi soldiers died in a suicide bomb in nearby Bakuba. Many fear the delay in forming a government just fuels the insurgency. Israeli troops have begun withdrawing from the West Bank town of Jericho. It is the first of 5 towns to be handed over to Palestinian security forces in the coming weeks, following an agreement reached at last month's Middle East summit. The Palestinian flag was raised at the town's central checkpoint to begin the official handover. Violence in the area has abated since the most recent summit, but militant groups, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, have not yet formally joined a ceasefire. A police investigator has told an inquest here that to the death of skydiver Stephen Hilder that the Army cadet had been suffering personal difficulties, indicating, he said, Stephen may have taken his own life. The 20-year-old fell 13,000 feet to his death at an airfield in North Lincolnshire in the summer of 2003. Both his main and his reserve parachutes had been tampered with, but police have ruled out murder. The inquest was told of injuries to Stephen Hilder's legs, which may indicate an attempt to minimise the impact of his landing. 2 doctors involved in the late abortion of a fetus with a cleft lip and palate will no longer face criminal charges. A police inquiry was reopened following a judicial review that was instigated by the Reverend Joanna Jepson, who grew up with a facial deformity. But the Crown Prosecution Service has decided to drop the case. Right to Life groups say they are considering a legal challenge. And police have arrested a man and a woman on suspicion of the theft of an 82-year-old woman's body from a graveyard in Staffordshire. Detectives investigating the case have written to the family of Gladys Hammond to say that they have retrieved her remains. The pair who were arrested are both in their 30s and they're being held in Gloucester. Mrs. Hammond's family owns a guinea pig farm which has been targeted by animal rights campaigners in the past.
After the break, President Bush reveals his new man at the World Bank. Paul Wolfowitz, arch neocon and architect of the Iraq War.
Transform your kitchen with these Napoli units for £270. In fact, all kitchen units are half price, and some have an extra 25% off. Homebase.
He's better known for his hawkish push for war in Iraq than promoting development and aid, but Paul Wolfowitz has been nominated as the next head of the World Bank when the current chief retires in June. President Bush put forward his controversial Deputy Defence Secretary, saying he was a compassionate and decent man. Traditionally, European leaders nominate the head of the sister organisation, the IMF, and leave America to choose the bank's head. But, as our international editor Lindsay Hilsum now reports, Mr. Wolfowitz could face some tough opposition during the approval process.
Paul Wolfowitz was one of the most vocal architects of the war in Iraq.
If he will not disarm voluntarily, we will do it for him by force, and his regime will join the Taliban in the dustbin of history.
So much for the Bush administration's new conciliatory foreign policy. Around the world, Mr. Wolfowitz is associated with the torture of Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib.
Mr. Secretary, you're dissembling, non-responsive. Anybody would say putting a bag over someone's head for 72 hours, which is,
I believe it's not
sensory
humane.
deprivation.
Strikes me as not humane, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Today, President Bush praised his nominee.
Paul is committed to development. He's a compassionate, decent man who will do a fine job in the World Bank.
But Wolfowitz is a hate figure for the left, his image epitomised in the Michael Moore film Fahrenheit 9/11. Although President Bush suggested today he had cleared it with major European leaders, several European representatives on the World Bank board are reported to have protested the nomination.
His background is very much in promoting US interests within the State Department and within the Department of Defense. Promoting development clearly is a very different set of issues.
In recent years, the World Bank has spearheaded debt relief for poor countries like Ghana. Mr. Wolfowitz was previously ambassador to Indonesia, but has no experience of banking or economics, and some fear he may pursue a political rather than a development agenda. Anti-globalization protesters frequently criticized the World Bank and the IMF. But its current president, James Wolfensohn, has been praised for focusing more on alleviating poverty. World Bank insiders fear that could now change. Today's nomination follows the appointment of John Bolton as US ambassador to the UN. Two ultra-hawks now have profound influence in the international system they've publicly disparaged. Paul Wolfowitz in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. By custom, the World Bank board accepts the American nominee as president. But the French today demurred, and others may now follow suit.
Lindsay Hilsum, I'm joined now by the former International Development Secretary Claire Short, a compassionate and decent man.
This is really shocking. It's as though they're trying to wreck our international systems. They put an anti-UN man into the UN and then nominate a man with no record on development who drove the Iraq war and, of course, in the Pentagon was responsible for Iraq after the war, and that is a complete and absolute disaster, the worst post-conflict situation that we've had in the world for a very long time.
Do you imagine Mr. Bush will have called Mr. Blair?
I kind of imagine he might have, but then I don't know.
What would Tony Blair say to Paul Wolfowitz?
Well, you know, this Commission for Africa report, it says we are no longer going to have a carve-up between the US and Europe about the World Bank and the IMF. It should be open to the best candidate in the world. So here's the first test. Europe should stand together and say, no, sorry, no record of development, would be very destructive, not an acceptable candidate. America vetoed Europe's candidate for the IMF recently, and of course Europe gave in and nominated someone else. So here's a test.
Well, but with the Berlusconi-Blair axis, it's most unlikely that'll happen, isn't it?
Well, we will see. And I think it's a test of what the Africa Commission report says. It says what I've just said. But if we can't stand up to the Americans, it's like they're playing games with us. They're putting this hard-nosed hawk into the World Bank just when we're all saying we're going to focus on development and reducing poverty. It's like two fingers to the world.
But what would you say to those people who say, well, it's just the World Bank, so what?
The World Bank is the biggest, most powerful, with the biggest concentration of funding development institution in the world. It's key everywhere. The NGOs have a pop of it because, of course, way back it was the instrument of neoliberal policy. But it's since under Wolfensohn, it's focused on the reduction of poverty. There's been lots of improvement. It's the biggest chunk of the programme.
Can one man make a difference?
Yes, a significant difference, the President. Yes.
And are you throwing down the gauntlet to Tony Blair? Show your mettle?
I think this is a real test of Europe. If Europe accepts this, then forget your multipolar world, forget Europe balancing America. It's the American empire can do what it likes.
What does it say to the G8 in Gleneagles in July?
Well, it says America's going to do what it likes and you better go along with it or hard cheese.
Claire Short, thank you for coming in. Back to our main report tonight, Gordon Brown's final budget before the expected election in May. As ever, he claimed it was prudent rather than irresponsible and certainly there were no pre-polling day giveaways. But what generosity there was, the Chancellor directed at pensioners. Every pensioner household will receive a £200 council tax refund, and there'll be free off-peak local bus travel for over 60s and disabled people right across the country. On housing, the stamp duty threshold is doubled to £120,000, particularly helpful for first-time buyers. For all taxpayers, the personal allowance goes up to £4,895. That's in line with inflation. There's a penny on beer, 4 pence on a bottle of wine, 7 pence on 20 cigarettes, all the usual increases in duty in line with inflation. The duty on petrol goes up by 1.2 pence a litre, with the increase deferred to September the 1st. So, with widespread disaffection with Labour and a lacklustre start to their election campaign, Gordon Brown will be hoping his 9th budget, especially those handouts to pensioners, working families and home buyers, will sway the floating vote in marginal constituencies across the UK. Shipley in West Yorkshire is typical of such Labour marginals, a former mill town, once a safe Tory seat, and an area where people are largely unconvinced of Gordon Brown's fabled economic prosperity. Our reporter Jane Dodge reports now from Shipley on whether Mr Brown's package of sweeteners will win their hearts, minds and, above all, votes.
These are the people Gordon Brown wants to woo, known in the trade as the grey vote. If these pensioners at the Anchorage Activity Centre in Shipley are anything to go by, it won't be an easy courtship. We spoke to them before and after the budget. To begin with, all of them, Labour and Tory supporters alike, expressed disenchantment with the government.
Well, I think they've let the pensioners down, I do, because they say they'll do things and they never do it. And I think that if you've saved all your life, well, you'll come off worse than the people that have spent every penny they've got. And it's about time that they did something for us that's been thrifty.
There's lots of issues, the police, there's the hospitals, the schools. I think they've all been let down.
I feel that all they're doing is looking after themselves. And they may give us a rebate now, but next year they won't bother.
Gordon Brown is really going to have to work his charm here in Shipley. It's a Labour marginal, teetering on the edge. Traditionally a Conservative seat, the current Labour MP has seen his majority slip to just 1,500. Is this budget going to do enough to allow him to keep his job?
Not as far as Sarah Hall is concerned. She's set to benefit substantially from the increase in child tax credit announced today. It'll mean an extra £728 a year for her and her 3 children. But more money in her pocket hasn't won her over.
Yeah, it does make me want to vote for Labour because of the child tax credits, but what he's done for us in the years he's been in has been nothing really. Everything's going downhill really compared to what it could be like.
So are you likely to support the government come the election or not?
No, I think he cares more about other countries and about what Bush says and everything than what the people of Britain are saying.
The Chancellor may find more favour with first-time buyers in Shipley. The average price of a house here is £120,000. From today, properties worth that or less will be exempt from stamp duty.
I think certainly looking at the current levels of stock that we've got, probably about 50% of our properties will now no longer have stamp duty applying to them. So again, makes them more affordable to people, more appealing perhaps to the buyers that are out there looking. And certainly the buyers that register with us looking for properties within the area, probably about 50% of those are first-time buyers. So again, good positive signs.
But what about our disenchanted pensioners? We returned for tea and cakes to see if the Chancellor's sweeteners, a rise in the basic state pension, free off-peak bus travel and a one-off council tax refund of £200 had gone down well.
This is just a budget. Why haven't they done this before? Why have they had to wait until it's a budget? And that's going to have an election shortly, I presume. And it's just a gimmick to try to get people to vote for them.
I think the pension's not enough. I don't think we've had enough rises to bring us in keeping with the wages of today. And I don't think it's good enough.
Shipley is just one of 12 Labour marginals in West Yorkshire. The Chancellor is no doubt hoping today's budget will see off both the Tory and Lib Dem opposition. Jane Dodge, Channel 4 News, Shipley.
Here in the studio, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, sometime soon to be High Commissioner to South Africa, Paul Boateng, Conservative Shadow George Osborne, and Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesman Vince Cable. We're also joined for an above-the-fray perspective by Robert Choate, Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Robert Choate, let's deal with this council tax for a start. £200 one-off for every pensioner in the country who's paying council tax, whereas the Tories are £500, or up to £500, 50% at any rate, for the duration of the Parliament, as far as we can see. So who's doing better under which?
Well, clearly it would do better under the Conservatives if you end up getting the Labour giveaway first and then the Conservative giveaway afterwards. But in terms of comparing the two measures, if they were alternatives, then the Labour measure does seem to be more focused towards a wider variety and at the bottom end of the income distribution than the Conservative one.
Even though it's a one-off?
Yeah, and that is true, though. It is a one-off. The other question, though, is that there are lots of one-off measures which are announced which are then very difficult not to repeat or to mimic in future years. So whether you manage to leave it as just one-off remains to be seen.
Vince Cable, we might as well find out where the Liberal Democrats are on council tax. How much are you going to give the pensioners?
Well, we're going to change the whole system. I mean, what Brown has been doing today is tinkering, in effect. And we want to get rid of council tax as a whole because it's highly regressive. It's not just that it bears on pensioners, that is a major issue. It also bears on all people on low and middle incomes.
Well, it'll be there while you're doing that. I mean, you can't do it overnight.
No,
so
it would take a year.
You're going to give them 200 or 500?
Well, we will, in fact, generate 2.8 billion from our higher rate of tax, the 50% rate on incomes over 100,000. And that would go back into cutting local tax rates.
How much?
It would go back. The average family would benefit by about £450 a year, the median family.
Right, Paul Boateng, why not be prepared to do this for the duration of the Parliament?
Well, what we're doing is this. We're recognising that pensioners need to share in the rising prosperity of the nation. We recognise that...
No, that's enough. What we want to know is why not do it for the whole duration of the Parliament? That's the only question I'm asking.
Because we recognise that we've instituted a review on council tax, the Lyons Review. What this does in Budget 205 is to enable pensioners to gain the benefits of rising prosperity in precisely the way...
So by 206 you'll have fixed it?
In precisely the way that Robert has indicated, recognising that we need to focus the most help on the pensioners with the greatest needs. And that's what we're doing, not just with this particular provision in relation to the council tax, but also in terms of the pensioners' tax credit. It's about making sure that we share the wealth of the nation in a way that recognises the particular contribution that pensioners have made, but also the particular needs they have.
206, you'll have fixed it.
What we're not going to do is to anticipate the budget in 206.
Your Lyons Review and all the rest of it.
But what I do say is that the council tax needs to be addressed. It is presenting a problem, and we've got the Lyons Review in order to help us do just that.
George Osborne, the £500 maximum, the 50%, that is for the duration of the Parliament?
Absolutely, that's year on year. That's the great contrast with what Paul's just been talking about. But I mean, if ever you wanted a clearer indication that this is a vote now, pay later budget, then look at this £200 that goes to pensioners. Just for 1 year, just happens to be probably a month before the general election.
But if ever you wanted, wanted an indication that the Tories were most interested in rich pensioners, this would be it, wouldn't it?
No, this goes to everyone who pays council tax. That is a huge
but the more
number
you pay,
of pensioners.
the more you get.
That is not rich pensioners.
The bigger house you're in, the more you get. Whereas this one affects everybody.
We are helping people with their council tax bills, and I have to tell you, John, there are people who are paying very high council tax bills, pensioners who've seen up to a third of their pension increase taken up in council tax bills, who will be helped enormously by the Conservative policy.
What about poor pensioners in small houses?
Well, there are many other measures that you can use to help people who don't pay council tax bills.
But you haven't introduced them.
We are talking about helping people with council tax bills. So obviously you need to be paying a council tax to get it, but it is a major boost to the pensioners' income and a complete contrast to the one-off giveaway that...
Let's go to stamp duty. Robert Choate, this stamp duty. Isn't the danger that in doubling the allowance to stop people having to pay stamp duty to 120,000, you actually boost competition for houses?
Exactly, and it may well be people who own houses that are worth between 60 and 120,000 that are actually the main beneficiaries of this, not people who are going to be buying houses of that sort for the first time. It's the sort of impact that you traditionally get with this sort of tax change, is that it'll get absorbed into the price more than actually affecting first-time buyers. So there will be gainers, but not necessarily the ones that it's being aimed at.
Well, John, that's precisely why this is part of a package that is designed, on the one hand, yes, to help buyers with problems in relation to stamp duty, but also at the same time to invest more in social housing, to invest more for first-time start-up buyers who are key workers. All of that we're able to do because of the management of the economy, sound, stable, and all of that will be threatened by George Osborne's £35 billion take at the end of the 5th year of a Conservative government. That's what Oliver Luckman said, £35 billion less.
What are you doing to stamp duty?
We would implement the change announced in the budget. We're very happy to do that. But he didn't point out, Paul, that if you read the detail of the budget book, which, not the speech that Gordon Brown gave, but the detail of the budget book, they're actually predicting that they'll take more money in stamp duty. The Exchequer will take more money in stamp duty revenues than previously. So for all the talk of a cut for homeowners, actually stamp duty revenue is going to increase.
Untrue because he's hold on. You are confusing the domestic and the commercial.
Well,
let's concentrate on the domestic. 50% of buyers will benefit.
Lifting the
first-time buyers
was something we'd specifically advocated. I don't actually agree with Robert's analysis. One of the key problems for first-time buyers is actually liquidity. It's finding that £1,000 or whatever it is, and for the 400,000 people who are paying the 1%, that is a key constraint on getting into the housing market. We welcome the improvement as far as it goes. It should have gone to 150,000, but the average price for a first-time buyer is 130,000 plus. So it's a very limited concession, but welcome as far as it goes.
Okay, Robert Choate, the truth is that this is being described by some as a prudent budget, but it's entirely prudence's skirt only stays up if growth goes on at 2.5 to 3%. Is it realistic? Will it happen? And what happens if it doesn't?
Well, certainly it's true to say that this is a much less generous giveaway budget than we had in the run-up to the 2001 election. So if the Hippocratic Oath is first of all do no harm, then this is meeting that. The question in terms of what has to happen after the election is the Treasury right in expecting the sort of growth in tax revenues after the election above and beyond what is explained by economic growth? And that is where the main differences are between the Treasury and most other commentators. This is all hugely uncertain, but most would say that they're just not going to get as much revenue in the future. So to fill that gap, you'd probably need more tax increases announced after the election.
George Osborne, you'd be lumbered with this. What would you do?
Well, we would set out a programme to curb the growth of public expenditure.
Cuts?
That is not cuts. Excuse me, Paul. We are going to invest greatly more in schools and hospitals and frontline services, but we are not going to spend quite as much extra as Labour. That enables us to avoid the tax increases which are coming this way if Labour is re-elected, as Robert Choate has just confirmed. Taxes like 3% on national insurance. If the Conservatives are elected, then we will cut taxes. So the choice of the election is very clear. Lower taxes and value for money under the Conservatives, higher taxes under Paul.
John, for the past 4 years, I've come on your show. It's been a privilege, and on every occasion,
we're going to miss you.
On every occasion, it has been suggested that Gordon Brown wouldn't actually meet the forecast he's made for growth. On every occasion, he has, and other commentators have come in line with him. The great difficulty for George Osborne...
You'll come back from South Africa if
The great difficulty for George Osborne is that his is a party who have pledged cuts.
Right.
His is a party that saw inflation and interest rates rise.
Is it going to happen?
3 million unemployed twice.
What is clear common ground? The tax take is going to rise under all three parties, and Robert Choate will confirm that. Public expenditure is going to have to be disciplined. We're all going to have to accept tough choices. What we really do need is a proper independent system for looking at the assumptions the government's making, its forecasting. It's highly uncertain, and we don't even trust the government's figures. And that we would do.
OK, final question, very short. This oil number, for which they're managing to raise £1 billion and bringing forward the tax, is it a windfall tax?
It's a windfall tax by another name. It accelerates their tax payments, so you're basically getting a one-off hit, which conveniently pays for the one-off giveaway to pensioners.
Yes or no? Good idea?
Well, we would accept. We have to accept it. But
yes or no?
We have to accept it.
Yes or no?
Great
yes,
idea.
Obviously.
Bad idea, it'll hit investment in the North Sea.
You used to work for Shell.
Indeed, but that's not the point.
You would say that,
That's not the point. It's bad for the North Sea.
And there was further reaction to this budget this afternoon, with the nationalist parties accusing the Chancellor of ignoring Scotland and Wales and simply producing a pre-election budget aimed at winning votes in Middle England.
He climaxed his budget statement in a flourish by saying there'll be free bus passes for pensioners. We already have that in Scotland. I don't know if Gordon's aware of it, but in Cowdenbeath and his own constituency, they already have that, actually. So I think it was typical of a budget which was certainly designed to boost Brown's reputation as a great Brit, but he only actually managed to mention Scotland twice in the entire budget speech. So in that way, he's failed the tartan test. He's so anxious in becoming British Prime Minister, he's forgetting the people back home.
But I also think the budget has failed the whole of the UK in terms of regional policy, because we do know we're in one of the most unequal states in Europe. We have this huge divide from an area like I represent, which is at an area like London, where the income divide is 4 times, and that's replicated in the northeast of England, Northern Ireland as well. So this is a budget that concentrated on certain types of people in certain crucial marginal seats of the Labour Party, but hasn't really addressed the needs of the UK as a whole.
So no ignoring the small parties, and a big thank to the 3 big ones. Thank you. Now, £600,000 to educate us on the benefits of European Constitution money well spent, or a waste of taxpayers' money. What do you think? Sarah Smith has been looking into this latest row with Brussels.
Anti-European politicians have described a multi-million-pound campaign aimed at explaining the details of the EU Constitution a monstrous abuse of taxpayers' money. While European leaders put their signature on the new constitution last October, most are preparing for a referenda on the subject. Ahead of that, members of the European Parliament have approved £6 million for an education campaign to explain how the constitution will benefit them in their everyday lives. Critics say the word benefit means it's propaganda. Well, the British government says it doesn't believe the funding should go ahead. And earlier I spoke to the man who would get the money, Dermot Scott. He's the director of the European Parliament office in the UK. And I asked him whether the literature would actually advertise a pro-EU constitution position.
And we know that in many member states, and not excluding the United Kingdom, there's a fairly low level of comprehension of what actually is in the document. So we feel it's an important part of our activity to distribute it and to put it on our website.
But if it's explaining a favourable view of the Constitution, surely you can see how in advance of a referendum that looks as though taxpayers' money is being spent on advancing just one side of the argument.
The European Union has had its own funding since 1970, and since then the European Parliament has had a decisive say in how the budget of the European Union is adopted. And every year we have an information budget for our office and among the other 25, and we spend this on informing journalists and so forth. Now, what we're doing is simply a continuation of that. There's nothing particularly favourable or unfavourable about it. We are explaining what's in the Constitution, and we will also have a duty to explain what Parliament's position is on it.
The British government have made very clear that they do not want you to spend this money. They obviously think it will be counterproductive in the argument for a European constitution. Aren't you prepared to listen to their arguments?
We're obviously very respectful of the views of the government and of the views of the climate of opinion in the United Kingdom, the views of the British MEPs and of others. But we've been specifically instructed. The Budgets Committee of the European Parliament voted unanimously in October to have this budget line. It has now adopted it. It voted in January to instruct us to make known the views of the Parliament and, more importantly, the content of the Constitution itself. So what we will be adopting is a very much reactive role. We won't be going out and selling things, but if people come to us and ask us for information, we'll be giving it. And the same applies to our website. So we won't be forcing the website into anybody's PC, but if people log on, they will find information there. So the bulk of our activity will be to do with those two issues.
Dermot Scott talking to me earlier. Now, scientists gave a stark warning today for residents of southern Asia. As a result of the devastating tsunami in December last year, they think there is an increased likelihood of another earthquake around the Indian Ocean. The tsunami disaster put more stress on an active fault line in the region, making another quake of up to 7.5 on the Richter scale more likely. Now to the Cheltenham Festival, and Moscow Flyer has won the big race of the day. The 6-4 shot won the Queen Mother Champion Chase and became only the second favourite to win at this year's festival. Jockey Barry Geraghty steered the horse to its second victory in the race, well ahead of Well Chief. Azad Tayub was a distant third. It seems the famous Atkins diet may not be as popular, or maybe not quite as tasty as was first thought. The company, Atkins Nutritionals UK, which markets a range of food products based on the dietary philosophies of the late Dr. Robert Atkins, has gone into administration following disappointing sales. And to the rest of the markets now. Share prices took a tumble following Gordon Brown's budget speech. The index of 100 leading shares finished the day down by 62 points. A short time ago, the pound was up by more than a cent against the dollar, and sterling was down slightly against the euro.
When we come back, why men are just degenerate women. Scientists unlock the secrets of the X chromosome.
1664. A bad year for composing. A good year for beer. Cronenberg, 1664.
During your lifetime, your eyes will capture over 24 million images. To enable us to see exactly what you're seeing, every Vision Express optometrist has over 100 different ways to assess your eyes. For a thorough eye examination, see an expert. Vision Express.
They do. What is the difference between men and women? Research published tonight in the scientific journal Nature throws new light on the evolution of sex. Apparently proves what every woman will say is blindingly obvious, that they are more complex than men. Scientists have completely mapped the X chromosome, of which men have only one, while women, of course, have two. Geneticists say that the development could lead to new treatments for diseases, in particular those affecting men. With me, our science correspondent, Julian Rush. Well, Julian, what's so important about an X chromosome?
Oh, the X chromosome is absolutely special, John. It's all about sex. It's what makes a man and a woman a woman. As you say, women have two of them. They get one from their father and one from their mother. And it does make them much more complex and much more variable than men. And that's because in every cell in a woman, because they have two X, they have to turn one of them off. They're randomly turned off. Otherwise, they get too much of a good thing. It stops producing too much protein. But it turns out, they discovered in this research published today, that not all these genes are turned off. And that also that some of these genes, which are expressed in women extra like this, it changes with age and with the tissue that it's in, different parts of the brain or parts of the body. And that makes women much more complex, genetically at least. Now, men have an X and a Y, and a Y, it turns out, is once the same as the X, but over time it degenerated and lost most of its genes. But X is important because it gives scientists ways of unlocking genetic causes of disease. Now, the X chromosome has around 1,100 genes on it, including the biggest, which is the one that, if it's damaged, causes Duchenne muscular dystrophy. There are over 300 diseases linked to the X chromosome, and only half of those have been identified. So this will allow the work to identify the others to be speeded up. And around 100 genes on the X are linked to mental disability, resulting in from poor brain development and brain function. And research into about 400 families is now going on to find out which genes are behind these mental development problems. Now, a whole bunch of these diseases, things like haemophilia and red-green colour blindness, it's caused by defects on the gene. Now, in women, if one of these is not working properly, the other one can kind of compensate for it. That doesn't happen in men. And one of the diseases that is likely to benefit is autism. It's largely a problem of boys, and so X chromosomes are believed to be a factor in it. The full decoding will allow scientists to hunt for those genes.
There are genes on the X chromosome which contribute to autism. And finding those will not only provide a clinical benefit to the families who suffer mutations in those genes, but may also provide broader insights into how autism arises in the first place and the biological processes which underlie the natural processes which then go wrong in autism.
And there's just one other thing they've learned. How old is sex?
Sex is 300 million years old. They were once the same, the X and the Y gene, but over time they changed. But 300 million years, sex started.
Thank you, Julian. Well, the main headline tonight, sweeteners for pensioners, first-time buyers, working families. For Gordon Brown, today's budget is the prudent course for Britain, he says. But to Michael Howard, a case of vote now, pay later. We're back tomorrow noon when we will have a panel of experts to address your questions about the budget. Our wise men and women will answer as many of your questions as they can. Email us with your views. Usual address, channel4.com/news. So till noon tomorrow, again at 7, Sarah and for me. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.